So I am now recording this. Yes. So we'll have it for your classmates to watch later on. And I asked Mr. Seiz to start by just sort of telling us a little bit about his career and, you know, what kind of work he's done with water. And then maybe he'll tell us some interesting experiences.
I hope so. And please, if you want to ask any questions, Jordan, please do. I'm really more interested to learn about you as well. So I would appreciate questions. So quick background. I have a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. And from there, I started working in local government, which means many times municipalities or county government systems. But I started working in local government. So a small city in Ohio, eventually went to a town in Illinois called Rock Island, Illinois, and then eventually ended up down here in North Carolina working for a much smaller town called Carborough. So using my engineering skills, started out doing engineering design in streets, sewer and water, and stormwater. And then eventually became more interested in the maintenance side of it, and actually went back to grad school when I was 47, I think it was, and got a master's degree in public administration, which helped me in my work in a local government situation, so the public administration part of it. So I became a little more management than hands-on, which I was before. So, and that's not too unusual for people going through their careers. But that's what I had, and that's what it worked out for me. And so I did it for 41 years. I'm recently retired. But yeah, I had a very satisfying career in public service. So I didn't start out in my passion. I really wanted to be a landscape architect. And somehow I went into civil engineering and found a niche, you know, that was very satisfying and fulfilling for me through a career. Now that I'm retired, though, I work over at church planting trees and bushes and shrubs, trying to pick up when I think I wanted to be a landscape architect. So I kind of get something later in life like that. Did that sound mean something special?
No, I'm sorry. I need to stop Slack because it doesn't need to interrupt us. There we go. All done.
Okay. So the other important thing I wanted to tell you is I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, and I have a 96-year-old mother. And with that, you have a much different perspective on things going through life. So I think back about the earlier years and so forth, and I guess if there's anything I can pass on is that your perspectives change throughout your career, and that's good. You get not necessarily a better, but you get a different perspective. Having a 96-year-old mother who needs a lot of assistance, and then having 3 wonderful little grandchildren, you know, which are a delight, and they're learning to do things and so forth. And we Skype. So I have a little bit of experience with this kind of technology, not as much as I used to. But and I guess the other reason for pointing that out is that your passions and ideas change throughout your career. And also there's nothing wrong with that. Having great intentions of wanting to do something, landscape architecture, finding something else. And then as I went along, continued doing design, but found another interest in terms of the administrative aspect of it. So all those things were kind of rewarding. Plus, going back to school was always a wonderful, wonderful thing. Any questions about that, please?
Yeah, so I was wondering, like, how you got into that specificity of civil engineering, like how you decided that's what you wanted to do.
Well, it's I didn't have a lot of choices when it came to college. My dad came home one day and said, "George, you can go here or you can go here." And the one school was a state school that offered engineering, where my strength, I guess, was in sciences and so forth. And the other school was business, which I had no interest in. And so I chose, it was Cleveland State. It was in the city that I worked at or lived at. And yeah, I was I'm just frankly, I'll say it, I was disappointed. But as it turns out, when I started looking through the course booklet at the curriculum, I thought, hey, maybe this is for me. And it was still working with projects outside, typical public works type projects, paving, sewer and water and so forth. So that's kind of what I picked. And I kind of struggled in the beginning, but then kind of found myself and eventually got a job in the field. And that was an important thing, because I worked a lot of part-time jobs helping to put myself through undergraduate school. And then all of a sudden one day I was in the right place at the right time, and there was a job opening at a local municipality in Cleveland. So that's how it happened.
Cool. Tell us a little bit about the design work that you did, like in that first job. Like when you talk about designing streets and sewers and what's involved in water, what's involved in that?
Okay. This was when I first went to Rock Island, Illinois, and was hired as a civil engineer to do design work. And the typical projects that they did were small paving projects. This was a city of about 60,000 people, an older city. It was a river town right along the Mississippi River. And we did a lot of repaving. So we tore up old streets that were in bad condition, and then would repave them. The same with sewer and same with water, even though they were underground. But they all kind of involved the same thing. You start out with a project plan. You analyze the need for it, maybe from a economic standpoint or just from a service standpoint, that the street is in such bad condition that cars are breaking axles or something. You need to do something. Or the water just isn't flowing fast enough and you have to provide a new pipe and so forth. From that planning process then and an estimate, then you go and do some surveying to determine the existing conditions. And from that surveying information, you know where everything is existing. You determine elevations so that driveways can meet, so the sewer and water is at the right elevation also. And then you go through a planning, putting together the plans that the contractor can then build from. Put it out for bid. So in local government, competitive bidding is very important to make sure that you're getting good prices. And then you have a bid opening. The contract is awarded, and usually the local authority, the city council or something, makes sure that the bids are correct and it's awarded, and then the contractor builds it. And then you have to make sure the contractor builds it correctly. And that's another aspect of engineering, where you have an inspector then to keep an eye on things and making sure you're getting what you're paying for. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, let me think of some other questions. What's the coolest project you think you've ever worked on?
Ooh, that is a really good question. Well, this is kind of a silly story. It wasn't the coolest project. I'm killing time here to make sure I can think of one. But one of the first projects I did, and I wasn't married yet, I designed a sanitary sewer for the dog pound. And so the whole thing was that there was a dog pound area which they hosed off. And I know this is kind of gross, but it's funny. And but the water and the sewage had to go somewhere else. And so I designed a sewer that took the wastewater from the dog pound into the sewer system. And I remember writing my girlfriend at that time, who's now my wife, a letter saying how proud I was that after 6 years of school, I could make dog pee go in a straight line. And so, at whatever I was, 25 years old, I thought that was pretty good. But it was the same concept then that I used on a lot of other projects than later. Probably one of the most coolest things I did for me was it was at a wastewater treatment plant where we had to design and construct some special beds that would take care of the sludge that came from the sewage. And the reason it was cool for me is that it involved doing pumping and a few other things. Up to that point, mostly I was just doing streets and sidewalks, which were kind of boring maybe a little bit compared to doing something different. So that was fun. It was I think was always good about municipal engineering. You were jack of all trades, but master of none. And so you got your hands involved in a lot of different types of disciplines: sewer, water, paving projects, transportation with traffic counts, and so forth. So I think being the kind of person I am, that was always good, because if I would have just been at a doing the drawing of it, design of it, I think I would have been pretty bored being put in that pigeonhole. It was nice to be involved in different things. Plus, it let me get outside. I'm kind of an outside person, and so I wasn't sitting inside all the time. I enjoyed the type of work that I kind of found.
George, it's interesting to me that you say that you eventually got more interested in maintenance, mm-hmm. because I don't know, maintenance doesn't sound inherently like design. Sounds more interesting to me inherently, but obviously it wasn't for you. What drew you to maintenance?
Well, maintenance is, it's not as glamorous, to be able to design something new and see the product, get in place and so forth. But in municipal work, a lot of times there's faults in the design that don't show up until later. Mm-hmm. And then the design has to be modified to make it work. And, sometimes it's as simple as some sort of grade change and so forth. But the stuff doesn't last forever. We would design things with a design life of 20 years. And I worked for the municipality for 28 years. And so in that period of time, some of the stuff just wore out. Mm-hmm. Others of it then needed some improvement. As an example, there was a pedestrian mall that was put in our downtown area. And economics at that time, the stores were leaving. The idea was put in this outdoor pedestrian mall, many of which you see, still today. But then over the years, the economy's changed in downtown. More stores came back in. And so the idea initially of taking out the streets and putting in a pedestrian mall ended up reverting back to the older style of people wanted access with their cars. So the whole thing wasn't taken out, but half of it was. So, in my lifetime there, I saw the street go out, or was the existing street, saw the street go out, and then I saw the street come back in. And so there's an example of things. So I found that very challenging, not only the maintenance, but the administrative part of it. Learning to manage a work crew then, which is a different type. It's a labor force. It's different than a design force. And I found that very satisfying, working with people that plowed the streets, fixed the streets, set up the signs. It was all very challenging.
What was the biggest change or difference you saw versus the beginning of your career and then the end of your career? Was there any big changes in your industry or something like that?
Well, there were certainly changes in the industry. I think the biggest change for me, though, was from a career, and I'll try to answer that aspect of it also, but from a career standpoint, was starting out where I did, where I was, doing design work, not really involved in decision-making so much. Yes, in the design, but I was told to design a project. I really had no input on the project. And as I advanced through my career, became more involved in those aspects of it, working with the public, finding out what the needs were, putting together a project then or a service that would serve the public. And then as I even advanced further, so besides being involved in the decision-making process, eventually I got where I was part of the political process of that, and that became very, very challenging. So I worked with the city manager who worked directly for the city council, but then I would be at council meetings and so forth, listening to what they thought needed to be built and how it should be built. And it's not much different than what you hear in the news all the time, even at the federal level. There's a group of politicians, well-intentioned, who have certain ideas, and then there are staff or
Civil servants.
Yeah, civil servants, bureaucratic people then who carry out things and make those projects and systems work. But they also have a viewpoint on it, which can be different from the politics of it. And so in public administration, these two things, the political side and the administrative side, even though they work together, they are still somewhat separate. So it's a dichotomy that's inherent in public administration.
Any stories about that? Especially water related or anything?
Of the politics of it, I think.
Politicians wanting something that you didn't think was
well, yeah, I think I'm trying to think of a good one. One that's kind of on a pretty small scale was that our town provided leaf mulch. We collected leaves in the fall and then put them in a pile, and they were rotated so they could decompose. And then residents were allowed to come and pick up these leaves, and they would use them to enhance the soils in their garden, keep down mulch, and those types of things. And it all worked out pretty good, and there was a good balance, what we brought in and what we brought out. But we had one person on the council who decided that wasn't good enough, that we should actually take the leaf mulch out to the public and or load their trucks when they came in. Well, from my standpoint, we didn't have the staffing to do that type of thing or the equipment. And so as a staff person, I kind of dragged my feet initially because I knew somebody wanted this done, but the council person really didn't have, it was just one voice on the council. And then all of a sudden he got the ear of other council people, and then pretty soon George was told that this is kind of what we have to do. So I retired before it happened, but exactly what I described then took place. And so it cost some money, it cost staffing, and my idea of priorities and perhaps the city council was a little different. But they are the leaders of the community, and like all jobs, and you have a boss usually, there's a bigger fish in the sea, and you kind of follow and then implement it the best you can. You don't moan and groan about it, you implement it the best you can. But that's kind of an example of the dynamics, I guess, that happens sometimes. And it happens on a daily basis, you know. On a bigger scale here, as we've seen with the travel ban, is a good example at the federal level, where you have the White House initially imposing this travel ban, and then you had the various departments, and my knowledge of the federal government is somewhat limited, which I think most of us are, in trying to find out. But you had some of the various departments that were responsible then for implementing it hadn't been brought on board. And so the initial rollout of that travel ban was met with great resistance. And it took some time, but, you know, it went back and it was revised and so forth. There's still opposition to it, but it's a good example of sometimes when not all the parties that are involved with doing something, not only the political folks, but the staffing folks, the servants and so forth, are all working together and on board with something at a time.
Can you tell us any stories about, I don't know, big events that you had to sort of manage and handle, I don't know, relating to water, like storms or floods or anything, kind of particularly challenging times?
Yes, the one that comes to mind, and thank you for reminding me, was a flood on the Mississippi River. And this is when I worked in Rock Island, Illinois. And part of the responsibilities of the Public Works Department was to take care of the levee system, or this seawall that, when the water came up, would prevent the water from going into the town. And you heard a lot of this during Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, which was 2005, which was big news. And of course, more recently in Houston with flooding, although I don't think they have a levee system, but with 50 inches of water, it's hard to take care of anything. But anyway, in the Mississippi River, it was prone to flooding in the springtime, and various communities had systems put in place to hold the water back. And it was in 1993 that we had the worst flood there on record, and still is. And for 2 weeks, we pumped water, monitored the seawall and the earthen levee. Meanwhile, across the river in Davenport, Iowa, they did not have a levee system, and they were flooding. The downtown flooded badly. And they chose years ago, in the late 60s, early 70s, there was federal funding for building levee systems. Rock Island chose on the one side of the river to build one. Davenport on the other side did not. And so when the levee or the river would flood, there was a certain amount of animosity between the two cities, because Davenport didn't build a levee system because they wanted to maintain the natural view of the river. Rock Island did build a levee system, which in turn raised the level of water and made worse flooding over on the other side of the river. And so there was a lot of teeth gnashing about that type of thing. And the Corps of Engineers, who built most of the lock and dams on the Mississippi River to make it navigable, really helped the economy. But in later years here, as more flooding became more prevalent, a lot of folks questioned that type of design. Maybe we should have not built levees and just let the water go out where it could and spread.
Did the levees hold during that flood? Did you manage to
the levees
keep them up under all that pressure?
Yes, the levees in Rock Island held. We did get a few leaks, and we had to maintain it. It's kind of scary when you have this wall built and then you have 10 feet of water on the other side. An ending supply of water. It's not like a swimming pool. If it broke, it would just come out. It would come out for days, So it was scary, I must admit, when we had that. And we worked 12-hour shifts 2 weeks straight to keep an eye on things and keep everybody safe. But,
how do you plug a leak, like when it's an ongoing flood? I mean, when there's water pressure, when a small leak can come big very fast. Can it?
Well, it depends on what's leaking. So
Okay.
we had some concrete walls, and they had openings in them. And these concrete walls had these erector set like panels that would go in and fill up the space. And then you would have structure behind it that would hold the wall. But there were gaskets and stuff trying to seal the water out, and they would start leaking. And as the water got higher, there was more pressure, and it would leak even more. And then on the back side of this area were people. And so we would actually plug the leaks by throwing sawdust and ashes into the water right behind the wall. And what would happen is the water was flowing through the leaks. It would suck in the ash and the sawdust and plug the leaks. So it was very primitive. Yeah, it was just these people throwing, shovelfuls of stuff over.
Wow.
What was really scary was if the earthen levee would break, and you have to, this had it had a hard clay core. It had huge stones on it called riprap to prevent erosion. But that's why we had to monitor that. And the fear there was that animal holes, gophers and other animals would bore through it. And so we had to plug those with sandbags and so forth to make sure that the leaks didn't get worse. But we did have some leaks. So
I remember in Hurricane Katrina,
mhm.
when Lake Pontchartrain
Right.
there was held by levees of
Mhm.
some kind, and it had and it sprang a big leak, and they couldn't patch it and the entire lake emptied
right.
into New Orleans. So that's why, and the thing that I understood vaguely,
Mhm.
without an engineering background or anything, was that there was so much pressure coming that there was no way to plug something in the holes until the pressure was relieved on the other side.
I remember too seeing videos of that where the levee system and the wall actually had collapsed, and then they were working from the end of it trying to build it back. But the water pressure and so forth and the velocity of the water was so great that it couldn't do it. But there were a lot of lessons learned about that in terms of design and so forth. So it was always a shame when there's a loss of life, but at the same time, it was an eye-opening experience for the maintenance of the levee system. And we learned the same thing about ours in Rock Island, Illinois, after having the worst flood and the levee system really got tested. We found out what were the strong points of it, what were the weak points, and things that we had to maintain differently. The Corps of Engineers learned different things about design and so forth from that. So that's kind of life, though. That's an ongoing learning process, that I think we all do.
I have one more question, kind of related to like the gophers, like going under the levee and stuff. Like, were there any times when you had to kind of design, like keeping animals in mind, I guess, because something could happen where, like, I don't know, an animal could like chew through something, or like it was in an area that some animal lived or something?
Yes, I frankly, I don't think at this point in time the gophers were on the endangered species list or anything at that point. And so where we would see that they were living, had bored a hole or something, we would just block it off. And I'm sure they found another way out somewhere. Maybe they didn't. But we were trying to be sensitive about the animals and so forth. But it was, it was a riverside area with forests and so forth. There was no way that you were going to keep animals away. They just were. It was part of their natural habitat, and man built this big earthen levee in the way between the river and them. And I'm sure they were determined, like many species, to keep going where they did, and a lot just went up and over, and around. But that was part of the maintenance to keep an eye on critters doing damage to the levee. Just boring holes was the only thing that we really worried about. Most of the rest of the stuff wasn't really something that could be damaged by animals of any type. So.
Do you have any comment about Hurricane Harvey and Houston? And my understanding is that there were a lot of design or lack of zoning issues that made the flooding a lot worse than it might have been. Or any observations about that? Well,
I having been a person who's monitored rainfall for a long time, being part of a maintenance crew in a municipality when the thunderstorm comes or the tornado warnings, we do a certain amount of preparation, and you prepare for what you're used to having.
Mm-hmm.
And typical storms and those types of things. And then when a hurricane comes, even though we all know they're coming, they're all somewhat unpredictable. And then in Harvey's case, here it gets right to the edge of the water and just spins. And it was a phenomenon that rarely happens, but there it was, pulling 50 inches. And the reason I'm saying that is it's hard to imagine that. When we get a rainstorm around here, and you get a lot of rain up in Seattle, 2 or 3 inches an hour is a devastating in terms of flooding and so forth. So when you look at 50 inches over the course of, a day and a half, 2 days, I don't know that you could ever design for something like that.
Mm-hmm. So
the argument that, it was worse because of the low-lying areas, and there is something to be said for that, but I don't know that in that case you would have ever built things hard enough, or the zoning would have been good. I mean, look at the homes that were in properly zoned areas and so forth. You can just only do so much. But it does beg a point, though, I think, that the different ways of approaching a problem, and I guess what I'm referring to here is climate change. So a lot of people say climate change. This is an effect of climate change. And it's certainly, I think everybody now agrees that, yes, there's climate change. There's still two camps as to whether it's caused by man or not, or caused by humans, versus just the natural evolution of weather. But I think what's different is the approach to the problem, where in climate change, one approach is what we've seen with the Paris Accord, looking to actually impact the amount of CO2 that goes up into the atmosphere, lowering the gases, and which is trapping heat, which is causing the impact. So that's one way of doing it, and of course a lot of people argue about that. Another way is to, weather's getting worse, we'll just build bigger levees. We'll just build, we'll just protect. It's more of a reactionary response to what's going on, versus really doing something about it. And so I give another example of that is in wastewater treatment, you have all these different types of sewage and stuff going into the wastewater plant, and they keep redesigning. People keep redesigning wastewater plants to take all the different chemicals. That's one way of doing it. It's very expensive, but other ways is to actually go back to the source, and you have better controls over the chemicals that are going in and so forth. But that pushes a lot of political buttons, because you're now making that industry more expensive to take care of the problem. But it's kind of a common way, I think, that humans have addressed things. They, in some cases, go to the source and really try to be proactive in that way. And then there's other times that it's just reactionary, and that's kind of what we've done on the Mississippi River. We build levees. That's the reaction to more rain and more flooding. And really, should something be done more to control the amount of runoff and the amount of water and so forth?
Or where people settle.
Yes.
Where people live.
That's right.
How close.
That's right. When you look at the coast and both coasts, and you have the beautiful view of the ocean, and that's where we like to be, but then it's also prone to severe weather. And once people are there, and the real estate and the politics are such that people want to protect their investment. And again, it's a reactionary approach. And then look to engineering to solve those problems. And I think we all agree that I don't know how we're ever going to control earthquakes. And so we design buildings to withstand them, but maybe we shouldn't build where the fault lines are, like San Francisco.
where a lot of this class resides.
That's right, yeah.
Interesting. I have one last question for you.
Sure.
And that is, we're going to be, in the next 10 days, we're going to sort of shift over and take a look at the Flint water situation, and the lead crisis that is ongoing there, really. Any advice for students about, just given your background, of things that would be interesting to look at?
Flint, I think, is a good example of where people really rely and rely on their government for help. I think a lot of people would question whether they really got the help they needed, but Flint is a good example of where you have processes and organizations put in place to treat the water, and that's very important. It happens, ongoing across the country. And when those things go wrong, then people turn to local government or government for the answers to those things. And then sadly, in the Flint case, is an example of where people got entrenched in, didn't want to look bad, and there were cover-ups and so forth. And it's really a black eye on local government. And I feel that because having been in it. But there's a lot to be learned from that. And also learning from the recent hurricanes how dependent people are on government for taking care of them in crisis type situations. And mayors and presidents, keep their jobs based on their reaction to crises like that. And Flint is a good example where a lot of folks, the governor, got a lot of bad press over it, and local officials and people were let go. But it was an example of, I think, politically, again, people were trying to do something to help the community, and then the train got going a little too fast, and they didn't take all the precautions that they were supposed to take. And subsequently, they didn't think through the fact that this new source of water from the river that they were getting instead of from the lake was corrosive and have the reaction that it did. So that was one bad thing that they kind of missed in the beginning. And then maybe then following that, even worse was the cover-up for people afterwards. And so that's something that I think we respond to then at the ballot box in electing officials, to make sure that they're held accountable for the things they do. Did I answer your question there?
I think so. Yeah. Well, Jordan, thanks for being here. And George Seiz, thanks for being here.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we will all get a chance to follow up after the fact. So talk to you soon, Jordan.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.